Dungeons were one of the first known approaches of addressing criminal wrongdoing in the early 13th century and were typically placed in medieval castles throughout the world. During this time, there was a very fixed social and political structure, even with much insecurity and instability. Because of this, the rulers always feared another political ruler would come and conquer their land, which is why there was so much hostility and tension between political leaders at the time. These dungeons were used as a castaway to those who deemed to be such political threats. To end up in a dungeon, one does go through an extrajudicial process, which meant that an individual was taken without trial or knowledge of why they were being taken away, and this was primarily due to the fact that at the time the court system would have made the situation public knowledge, and political leaders wanted to keep such business on the down low so that their political platforms will not be diminished in any way. These dungeons were often placed in basements and attics of these medieval castles and placed away from the rest of the community. They were not very easily accessible and took time to get to them. The dungeon cells themselves were very small rooms with very little light, little to no furnishing, and made of stone. Dungeons would be a prime example of a retributivism approach to criminal wrongdoing, which approaches punishment of committing a crime as equal to the offense of the crime committed. This was an approach that looked solely in the present and had no intentions on preventing similar criminal offenses in the future. Capital punishment, also known as corporal punishment, was another common approach to criminal wrongdoing in history. This type of punishment included lynching, branding, whipping, and many more acts that resulted in causing physical pain to a person being convicted of committing an act of criminal wrongdoing. This type of punishment also takes a retributivist approach because the physical harm one was to receive was dependent on their offense. However, this type of punishment also incorporated individual and general deterrence, meaning that this type of punishment made sure that an individual did not want to commit a crime again, and also deters the audience who witnessed that inflicted pain from committing that crime or anything similar in the future. While deterrence was an intention of this approach to punishment, I do not think it was effective because causing physical pain is still not fixing the situation or helping those who caused the harm or to whom harm was caused to getting any better. Monasteries were religious affiliated communities that housed many people. These monasteries had cells which were where monks, nuns, and others were sent if convicted of a criminal offense. There was a rehabilitative principle behind these cells because the goal was for those who were sent there to spend time in their cells reflecting on what they did and how they can prevent committing the same or similar acts of wrongdoing in the near future. However, I do not think that this rehabilitative approach was as effective as could be, especially in this day and age. You do not have people walking around, those who committed acts of criminal wrongdoing say, "Oh, I love you," and "Oh, God still loves you," for a couple of reasons. One, because religion is not as big of a thing in our society as it once was, and two, our system is so corrupt that the implementation of rehabilitation requires much more effort by our society as a whole to truly be effective. Rehabilitation, the approach of restoring an individual after committing an act of criminal wrongdoing, is not a short-term process but a long one because it takes patience and time to truly change somebody and make sure they are on the right track of life and not going to consider committing wrongdoings to society in the future. I think a primary way to restore an individual is to educate them. Education is key and is often lacked in those who actually go through with committing acts of criminal wrongdoing because they have very little education on how to go around such offenses. Restorative justice, along with rehabilitation, is needed for society to effectively respond to acts of criminal wrongdoing in a non-punitive way. Restorative justice involves those who committed the crime, those whom the harm was done, and people mediating how to handle what was done and how to restore. It is an approach that looks at the harm that was done in multiple directions and does not just fixate on one side of the story, but instead focuses on every single piece of the story in order to properly understand how to restore what was done for all of those involved and affected. The use of restorative justice can be used side by side with punitive justice, which involves actually punishing an individual for committing an act of wrongdoing, as long as the punitive justice is properly being carried out and not just punishing an individual without a purpose, which is what I think is done in our current criminal justice system, which is why there is so much controversy as to if justice is truly being served.